When you read through the book of Acts, you learn about all manner of cool tales and adventures that all the guys got up to, like the time that Paul escaped from that city by getting lowered over the walls in a basket, and then there was that time that Peter got freed from prison by an angel, and then there was that time that Philip chased after that chariot and converted that dude from Ethiopia. But here's the thing, the Philip that chased after that chariot, he wasn't one of Jesus' disciples. Well, he was, but okay, let's back up a bit, because as is the case with all the apostles, things are about to get a bit confusing. So the guy that we meet in the book of Acts was indeed a gentleman called Philip, and he was indeed a follower of Jesus. There is of course the but, and that is but he was not one of the 12 disciples. Now this is generally a product of the fact that back in the day there weren't any surnames like we have today, so it got a bit confusing trying to figure out which Philip you're on about. It's also worth pointing out that back then the church was not quite as organised as we're used to today, so some stuff has sort of been lost in translation a bit. Certainly when I studied Greek and Hebrew that certainly became clear to me. The question is though, who was the chariot guy then? Well, yes, he's called Philip, but he's often referred to as Philip the Evangelist. Now this gent's first appearance was in the book of Acts, and his Cask Theology debut was in one of my first forays into church history, which went into all his chariot chasing. In the book of Acts, we learn that although he wasn't one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, he still joined in with all the crazy stuff they were getting up to. When we first meet him, he was being appointed as a church leader in Jerusalem along another chap called Stephen, who famously went down in history as being the first ever Christian martyr. They were chosen because of their Greek connections and were actually the liaisons to that particular community. After Stephen's demise, we see how this Philip joined Peter in escaping to Samaria, where he converted Simon the sorcerer, and then, after an angelic visitation, he went on to baptise the Ethiopian eunuch. He eventually settled in Caesarea, where Paul would later go and visit him and his 4 prophesying daughters. And it was at this point he'd now gained his moniker of the Evangelist. So, that covers one Philip. So what about the guy that was following Jesus around in the first place then? Well, yep, this guy wouldn't be in this playlist about what happened to the apostles if he wasn't actually one of the 12, and yet he was one of them. Like his peers though, he doesn't get too much of a mention, but he does get to play a part in some pretty significant events, before completely disappearing. We learn the most about him from the Gospel of John, but the synoptics do mention that he was part of the Jesus crew. John tells us that Philip was from the same town as both Peter and Andrew, and he was present when John the Baptist pointed out that Jesus was, and I'm paraphrasing here, kind of a big deal. Philip was asked how to feed the 5,000 by Jesus, and he was the one who introduced Bartholomew, or Nathaniel, to Jesus, who would later become one of the disciples. It suggested that like his namesake he had a connection to the Greek community, since they came to see Jesus via Philip, who asked Andrew, who then asked Jesus about them. Jesus' answer was to point out that it was soon going to be his time. During the Last Supper, Philip asked questions that led to Jesus launching into another one of his preachings, and that's pretty much it from this apostle. Obviously, he was there for stuff like Pentecost and all that, but that's not what this series is about. What happened to him after all that? Well, it's no surprise that things get a bit confusing at this point, as there's not really any historical records as such, but traditions about what happened. There's a very good reason I've talked about Philip the Evangelist, and that's because quite early on, both of these Philips got mistaken for each other, and their tales were getting mixed up and melded. Normally at this point I mention Eusebius and the Golden Legend, and this episode is no exception. However, in this case, the writer of the Golden Legend called out Eusebius for being silly and mixing up the 2 Philips, stating that on this occasion Eusebius had got it wrong because he thought that both Philips were one and the same person. The traditions that we do have about Philip, that we are sure are about the Apostle, are found in the Nag Hammadi Library, which, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, were a series of ancient documents found in the 1940s, but these taught us a lot about something we'll discuss in the next chapters of church history: Gnosticism. As with all the rest of the 12, all we've got to go on are traditions, and any writing that we do have about them was written hundreds of years after they were around. Now, there's 2 stories about Philip that stick out, which I'll go through now. Now, the first is that after all the stuff in Acts went down, Philip decided he was going to strike out on his own and set off on a solo missionary endeavour. We're told this tale by an apocryphal letter from Peter to Philip asking to come back and join the rest of the team. The second tale that we've got of Philip is from a document that was written by one of the contemporaries of Eusebius, and this was a apocryphal document known as the Acts of Philip. Now, This tells the story that Philip, along with his sister Mariamne and fellow apostle Bartholomew, set off to pagan lands to create a community that practiced celibacy, vegetarianism, and, shock horror, allowed women to wear men's clothes and become equal to them in terms of leadership. The document then gets really freaking weird as it starts to talk about talking leopards, snake and dragon cults, and some stuff that I dare not mention because 1, the comment section will catch on fire, and 2, let's put it this way, I will probably get cancelled on everything. But take my word for it, it gets weird. I'll leave a link down below for the curious. Now this bonkers account does tell us about the demise of Philip, however. As is usual for the apostles, they'd gone somewhere to preach and upset the local populace. In this case, Bartholomew and Philip were both crucified, but they preached to the crowd while they were hung up there. Bartholomew was released to preach another day, but Philip realised that his time had finally come, refused his release and died. Being an apostle, of course, means that he's had more than one death story, and the other one is a tradition that ends in his beheading. Well, with Philip's tale told, that concludes this section of church history. The last apostle to die, of course, was John, and his passing led us from one era to the next. With none of the apostles left and a new century on the horizon, it fell to new preachers and teachers to steer the faithful in the right direction, a group we now refer to as the Church Fathers. Unlike the apostles, whose tales are told with tradition, these guys actually left us a ton of documents so we can actually know what they were thinking when it came to all matters faith and church. So, stay tuned to find out who these gents were, and the best way to do that is, of course, to subscribe. Until next time, though, do go grab yourself a drink, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.